Hey everybody, it's me, being fucking gross, dipping and drinking my burned gas station coffee, early in the morning. By the way, not sponsored by or affiliated with 7-Eleven in any way. They've given me no compensation, except for, this cup of coffee, which I got free, but that was because I bought 6 other cups of coffee in the past couple of months. I don't buy a lot of coffee, so it takes me a while to earn a free one. But I earned a free coffee. I got it this morning because I'm very tired, and they have these little cups of very lightly coffee flavored caffeine called Stoke. So I put about 6 or 7 of those in my coffee. So I'll be good to go for the day. The reason I'm tired is because last night on the Game of Thrones was the Battle of Winterfell. Now, it's something a lot of people didn't want spoilers on, because Battle of Winterfell, I mean, it's Game of Thrones, right? So going into it, everyone pretty much assumed like we're losing half the cast. Surprisingly, didn't happen. I'm going to go ahead and just say this whole thing may have spoilers. So if you haven't seen it and spoilers will bother you, go ahead and tune out. All right, and you can watch this later. Or if you don't give a shit, then you could watch it now. Or if you don't trust my recollection, you can also watch it now. Because quite honestly, here's a little thing about Battle of Winterfell. Some of it was very confusing to me, and I'm not the only one, and that's very unusual. With something like this, I pay pretty close attention, and I keep fairly close eye on everybody that's on screen and what's going on with them, right? Something I've talked about before. As a mentally organized person, I like to keep track of where all the characters are and what their status is during a big episode like that where there's a lot of chaos. And I didn't really. And at first I thought it might just be me, but a friend of mine said the same thing. She said that it's almost as if she had watched it while on drugs, because she's been on drugs before and she's had that sort of fugue state memory where like she knows the gist of what happened and she remembers watching it, but she's fuzzy on some of the details even though she remembers seeing what happened. And it's kind of similar for me. I think part of it was because it was late at night. I'm the only one in the house that watches Game of Thrones, so I watch when everybody else has gone to bed. And part of it was because, you know, it's a battle taking place at night, very dark. But let's talk about that, because it was pretty interesting. And the thing about Game of Thrones, since episode 1, there have been fan theories, right? And that's owed partly to the fact that since the books have been out, there have been fan theories. I picked up my first dealings with it. There was a library discard fair, which my public library when I was a kid, they did it every year, right? And I was 14. It's 1998. And the library discard fair didn't just have library discards, it had donated books too, right? And I would always go because, and this is kind of a dumb thing. If you want to make fun of me for it, you can go ahead. But I didn't have any like up-to-date video gaming system until the year 2000 when I bought a Nintendo 64, specifically to get the Episode 1 racer that was packaged with it. It was on sale because Star Wars had been out for almost a year at the time. So I I didn't have an up-to-date video game system. We had the NES, starting in 1988 when we got it for Christmas, up until around 1999 when it stopped working, right? But I really loved reading about video games, right? And I used to go to this discard fair every year because somebody, I don't know who, but in their donations every year they would donate all of their Nintendo Power and GamePro magazines from the previous year, and I would snatch them up. So I went every year, but this year when I went, there was only one of the Nintendo Powers left, and I started looking around in the books, and I found some novels that were not appropriate for little 13 to 14-year-old me at all. I got them anyway, but there were 2 fantasy novels that I picked up that day. The first was Game of Thrones, which was relatively new. This was late 98, so it hadn't been out too long. And the other was The Hammer and the Cross, which I would love to talk about sometime. It's an alternate history of the Viking invasion of the British Isles, with Ivar Ragnarsson, who you guys probably know from Vikings, the TV show. Anyway, The Hammer and the Cross was an alternate history trilogy about a half Viking, half English bastard son who became a blacksmith and ended up leading the British and the Vikings in a couple different ways. It's a very cool book series, and I'd love to talk about that sometime. But Game of Thrones, so I read it, right? And I was confused because Game of Thrones was grouped into fantasy, and as a young teen, I was familiar with the Lord of the Rings and the Magic of Xanth and the Shannara books. So for me, fantasy was like magic and elves and shit like that. And when you read Game of Thrones, there's not really much magic in it. There is the opening with the others, and that's purposely sort of left ambiguous, right? So reading Game of Thrones, I didn't really group it with fantasy because, you know, aside from the very beginning and the very end, there's not a lot of meat to the fantasy in it. And I just sort of ignored it, right? Then around, I'd say 2002 to 2003, around that time, if you were on the internet at all back then, you remember it was, communities were mostly around message boards. We got like Facebook groups and stuff now. But before we had message boards, and our groups were Yahoo groups. Yahoo groups was a pretty big place for people to congregate for similar interests, right? Did a lot of role-playing and stuff there. Well, in one of my Yahoo groups and in a few message boards, there would almost always be a call to like, hey, what are your favorite fantasy books, right? It comes up all the time. And somebody said, hey, the Song of Ice and Fire series by George R. R. Martin. And they described the series. I forget which group it was, or if it was a message board or a Yahoo group, but it was one of them. They described the books, and that sounded really cool. Like his purposeful subversion of the usual tropes in fantasy really drew me in, right? I like that kind of subversion. As I've talked about before, I really like when stuff gets meta, right? And that kind of subversion really is, because like he knows he's writing a fantasy, and he knows the things that are typical in a fantasy, so he's purposely doing different take, misdirecting the readers, things like that. I love it. So I got back into it. I read Clash of Kings, and then I was hooked, right? And I brought up the message boards and the internet because it's not just how I got back into the books, right? Because like I said, I had just sort of ignored everything after I had read Game of Thrones. But later on, I went back into it. I reread Game of Thrones. I read Clash of Kings. That's when, if you guys know people who have gotten into the books, especially once the TV show started, people who got into the books. The community of Song of Ice and Fire readers was pretty small, but pretty damn dedicated to picking apart like every single line of those books for clues as to what was going on, right? So theories have been around since the very beginning. Now, one of my favorite theories was that Jon was Azor Ahai, and he was going to kill the White Walkers, the others as they were called, and that Davos was the flaming sword. And I always thought that was a really cool idea. That this is something I actually got made fun of just last week, because I started talking about who Ahai could be, and when I was listing all the different possibilities with each one, I listed like a person who would be the flaming sword, and then finally someone was all like, "So you're just like, it's not a sword? Is there no chance that he's just going to have a flaming sword?" And the thing about it is, I've always assumed when there's a prophecy in the Song of Ice and Fire books, because it's a theme with prophecies, right? That it's almost never literal. That's sort of the whole deal about oracles, going back to mythology. It's one of the big lessons in mythology. Every time there's an oracle that shows up in mythology, the whole point is that things turn out the way the oracle said, but not in the way that you expect, right? Think about like Oedipus, right? Oedipus's father was given a prophecy that Oedipus would grow up to kill him. So Oedipus's father has him sent away, right? And then Oedipus is raised not knowing that it's his dad, so that when he encounters his dad, he kills him, not knowing that it's his father. So the prophecy came true because Oedipus didn't know that was his dad, right? It's a common theme with prophecy. So I never assume the prophecy is like being literal. It's speaking figuratively. And one of the reasons people would think that Davos was the flaming sword was because when the story of the Azor Ahai was being told, the story about his sword involved the ways it was quenched and broken, and quenched and broken, and it wasn't until that final quench that it was ready to go, right? And so it talked about being quenched in the water, in the heart of a lion, and finally the person they loved. And that was Davos, because he was quenched in the Battle of Blackwater, and that tested him. And then when he was locked in the dungeon by the Lannisters, who are lions, and then finally, and this hadn't happened in the books yet, but we assumed it was going to, that he was going to lose Stannis, and Stannis would be the one he loved, right? Not literally like a lover or wife, just the person he loved, because he was devoted to Stannis. And it seems like Davos is probably not the flaming sword. I don't know what they're doing with the flaming sword. Some people suggested that one of the dragons was the flaming sword because they breathe fire. But they didn't really, I don't know, the quenching thing was what everyone was focused on. When Arya popped out of nowhere and killed the Night King, that was amazing and awesome. But I immediately, like, my first thought went to, well, in what way is she Jon's flaming sword then? So that's something I'm probably going to have to think on, because my brain's not going to let it go. I will need to. Thoughts about the episode, though. Great things that happened. Theon got his redemption arc against against himself and what he's done to the Stark family. And Bran had that great line where Theon basically apologizes for all the shit that has happened because of him. And Bran says, everything you did is what brought you here, so that you could do this. And that's a pretty good perspective on things. One thing that I thought would have been cool, I half expected it. I didn't really expect it, but I wouldn't have been too surprised. I just thought it would have been a really cool thing. Right after Bran looks to Theon and tells Theon that he's a good man, Theon attacks the others. Theon dies, and the Night King is slowly inching up on Bran. And then Bran looks up as if he's looking at the Night King's sword, right? The thought that popped into my head immediately right then was all like, Bran's gonna take off his face and reveal that he's Arya Stark and not really Bran. This whole time he's been Arya. Arya got out of the castle, replaced Bran in the wheelchair, and Bran is like in the roots of the weirwood tree underground right now. That didn't happen, but that would have been fucking cool. I think a lot of people would have lost their mind at that. Not really as many character deaths as I expected, and I'm going to rewatch it again here in about 10 minutes. I will probably catch some that I missed. Little Lyanna Mormont, I figured was going to die. It wasn't exactly subtle foreshadowing when she was told that she needed to be down in the crypt where she's safe, and she's like, oh no, I have to fight. Badass as fuck when she killed the giant white, though. That was amazing. Sacrificing herself, getting crushed to death, and stabbing it in the eye when no one else was even taking it on. That was just phenomenal. Dolores Ed dying was sad because everyone loves Ed. Ed's great. He's got some of the best lines in the entire franchise. So that was sad, but again, kind of saw it coming. Melisandre at the end, I didn't really see that coming. She just she took off her glimmer and just like walked out into the field of snow and collapsed because she's a million years old and just a walking mummy. Kind of would have liked to get some closure on that. The reveal that she's actually an incredibly old woman kind of never went anywhere. There was potential to do something with that, and it was never mentioned again. You just, after she took that off, from behind you could see that she had gray hair and a frailer body, and then she collapsed, so she didn't say anything about it. Kind of thought that could have been more. Dany, of course, I mean, I knew nothing was going to happen to her. She's got to stick around for a couple episodes because she's got to challenge Cersei and possibly Jon. Her and Jon still working together really well in this episode, but now that the threat of the others is gone, that's what had really brought them to peace in the first place. And since Jon is her nephew and the true heir, it's up in the air again, because she's shown before that she considers this her birthright. And a few episodes ago, right before the premiere, first thing I said was, and I said this online to a few friends, I said, how is Jon going to cement his claim to the throne if he even wants it? Because it is Jon Snow. Jon is much like his father, Rhaegar, in that Jon seems to care a lot more about the realm than his own position, right? Jon is the perfect example. There's an old saying that the best person to wield power is the person who doesn't seek it. And Jon is the perfect example of that. Jon has been very good when he's been given a role and given a position of power, but Jon never wants that position of power. Jon wants things to work out the way they're supposed to, and he wants the realm to be the best. He's what Varys keeps saying, right? Service to the realm. Jon wants the North, the Seven Kingdoms at large, but particularly the North, to be safe and secure. And he's doing what he has to do to get that done. But Jon never wanted to be Lord of Winterfell. He just wanted the North to be safe. And being Lord of Winterfell is what could accomplish that. Now, I mean, Jon, obviously, he's not going to want to be the king of the Seven Kingdoms. But if Daenerys can't get the job done, that's might be something he has to take. The problem that I identified, though, is how is Jon going to prove it? And someone immediately said, well, you know, Bran saw the vision of him being born, so Bran knows that he's legitimate because his parents were secretly married, and then Sam has the records of him being secretly married, and the first thing I responded to that was, okay, so his little brother and his best friend say that he's the true king. But that's his little brother and his best friend. So, you know, who is going to be inclined to believe that if they already don't want to? And I really liked that in the last episode when he revealed that to Daenerys, that was the first thing she said too. It was like, oh, so your little brother and your best friend say that you're the true king. How convenient for you, you know? I don't know. I have probably have some more organized thoughts in a little bit after I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna rewatch it and finish my coffee, because this was a bit of a roller coaster. I will say another thing I really loved about last night, Arya in the library with all of the whites walking around the library reminded me a lot of Jurassic Park. And then that dumbass white when she throws the book and they all start mobbing on it, allowing her to get away. And then the very perfect moment when she's escaped the library and she's in the hall, and then they start busting through the walls. Beric, a death again, saw coming. Thing about him was, we know he's died a bunch and he's been brought back. And like Melisandre said, he was brought back specifically so that he could make this particular sacrifice, right? I kind of saw that coming as well. I honestly didn't think he was going to get like as much of a screen time death. It annoyed me a little bit because I remember when Barristan Selmy died, and that was super anticlimactic. There are some people saying the Night King's death was a little anticlimactic as well. They wanted more of like a showdown in which he was defeated. I think the way it was done was sort of perfect for Game of Thrones, though, was the way it works. Subterfuge has always played a big part in the combat here. And, you know, Arya, she's got her list, obviously, and it sort of brings home that this is more important than her personal revenge. We saw that earlier when she was on the wall with the arrows, and she gets the guy right behind the Hound when it looks like she's aiming at him. Speaking of arrows, I mean, come on, Theon. That's those whites were way too close to range for them to be using arrows. They should have been on their melee game for that. Anyway, I may do another video about this episode. This is just my first impressions. But after a rewatch and a little bit of rest, we'll see if I have anything new to say about it. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you later. Go ahead and like, subscribe, share, do all of the normal YouTube shit that you know to do. I don't have to tell you how to work YouTube. You've been on here before. And I'll see you later. Thank you. Bye.